Hello friends, today I'm going to show you how to make a corset belt using this pattern. You can find this pattern in my shop and I'll link to that below. This is a great pattern if you're more of a beginner sewer and are intimidated by the Renaissance corset pattern I also have. This corset still uses many of the same techniques you would use in all corset making, but just a little bit simpler of a design to execute. So once you get your pattern printed out, it looks like this, just two pieces. Easy, right? Let's go over the fabric and the notions you'll need. You'll need your outer fabric. I'm going to use this floral brown cotton fabric, and then your lining, which should be a sturdier fabric like cotton canvas or denim. You're also going to need some sort of bias tape, either store-bought or you can make it from the fabric you're using for the outside of the corset, which is what I'll be doing. If you're buying it from the store, be sure to get 1/2 inch wide double fold bias tape. If you want to make your own, I do have a tutorial for making it, which you can find linked here. Next, you'll need to add a little bit of fusible, lightweight, or medium weight interfacing. You only need a couple of strips about 1 inch wide, so even if you just have some scraps, that should work. You're also going to need some grommets. I like to use 5mm size grommets, but you can use another size that you have on hand as long as they're not too big. Make sure your grommets are 2 pieces with separate eyelets, not the ones that are supposed to fold back on themselves. You'll also need a grommet setting tool of some sort. I have this big hand press, but if this is your first time grommeting, I'd recommend just buying one of the small hand setting grommet tools because they're a lot cheaper. They can look like this, or there's another kind that you use a hammer and dies to set them. Any of these will work. So that's basically all we need to get started, and then the first step is going to be to cut out your pattern pieces. You'll need 2 pieces of each corset front piece and 2 of each corset back piece for both your outer or self fabric and your lining. Once you've got that all cut out, you should have 8 pieces in total. Next, you'll take your front piece and layer it over your back piece, right sides together at the side seams. Make sure when you put these pieces together that you're matching up your notches on the side seams because the front piece is really easy to get flipped around. So you're going to just sew your side seams together here and repeat this step for both the self fabric and the lining for both sides of your corset. Now your corset should look like this, and just be sure to go over to your ironing board and press those seams open that you just sewed. So the next steps are going to be different depending on which style of corset you want to make. We have a few options here. The corset can have front lacing, back lacing, or both. First, I'm going to show you how to do the corset with front lacing, but if you want the corset to be closed in front, skip to the next step. So for a front lacing corset, take your lining and lay it on top of your self fabric so right sides are together, and you're going to sew these pieces together down the center front seam using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. When that's done, each piece you have should look something like this. Press your seams, but this time when you press it, you're going to press the seam allowances toward the lining only, not open flat. Next, we're going to add understitching to the lining, so that is a stitch that goes very close to the edge of the seam, about 1/16 of an inch away on the lining side. When that's done, it looks like this, and you can see when I flip this over that my stitch also sewed through that seam allowance that we pressed towards the lining. This is important because it's going to create an overall cleaner edge at your corset front. So repeat that for both sides of the belt, and then just fold that lining half under so you have a clean center front edge. Give this a good press with your iron, and we're ready to move on to the next step. So this next step is for a front lacing corset without back lacing. If you want to add back lacing as well, skip this step. So here we'll place our center back pieces of our self fabric together and just sew the center back seam shut. You'll also place the lining center back on top of its other half and sew those together as well. When that's done, your corset will be fully connected at the back like this, and just be sure that you press those seams open as well. This next step is if you're doing back lacing only, so your pieces will go back to looking like this where we started, and you're going to take one side of your belt and layer it over the other side, matching your center front seams. And you're just going to sew those center front seams together on both your self fabric and your lining. It should look something like this when you're done, and then take this to the ironing board and press those seams open flat. This next step is if you're doing back lacing. So if you're doing this, you'll do this step regardless of whether or not you decided to do front lacing or not, so just disregard my center front seam being sewn together if you didn't do that on yours. We're going to place the lining over the self fabric and match up the center front edges, and Daisy has come to help demonstrate this. Okay, so you're going to sew these seams together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If your cat decides to allow it that day. And when that's done, your belt should look something like this. If you did the front lacing option, then you will have 2 separate pieces, but at least the back should look like this. Next, you will sew some understitching at the center back seam. So if you missed the first part on this, you're going to press your seam allowance toward your lining, and then you'll sew a stitch on the outside of the lining 1/16 of an inch away from the center front edge. Be sure to catch the seam allowance in your stitching as well, so when that's done you have this beautiful understitch, and again that seam allowance is sewed to the lining, which will help create a cleaner center back edge. After you've done that to both sides, then you can fold those edges over and press them flat. So now we should be all caught up together no matter which style you decided to make. Now we need to cut some interfacing for the corset to reinforce the grommets. Just need to cut a strip about 1-ish inch wide, could be more, but at least 1 inch, and you'll need this everywhere you're going to put grommets. So if you're doing front lacing, you'll need 2 strips for the front, and if you're doing back lacing, you'll need 2 strips for the back. And if you're doing both, then you'll need it for both. So wherever you're putting the grommets, you'll take a piece of interfacing and line it up along the center front or center back edge of your self fabric and cut it to the length of that opening. Then just use your iron to fuse it to the fabric and trim down any excess pieces that stick out. So on this style, I've got it here along the center front edge, and on this style, I've got it along the center back edge. And if you have lacing on both edges, you'll put it on all 4 edges. Next, we'll sew our boning channels. So refer back to your pattern pieces to see the suggested boning channels indicated by 2 dotted lines on your pattern. You'll need some sort of chalk or fabric marker, and you're going to mark these channels directly on your corset. I find the easiest way to do this is to fold the pattern along one of those dotted lines, then line the pattern up with your corset and mark along the fold with your chalk. The next line should be about 3/8 of an inch away from the first line. So now you can just take a ruler and mark a line 3/8 of an inch away from the first line you just drew. Just make sure that you put it on the correct side. Then you'll do the same thing for all the other boning channels marked on your pattern. By the way, this chalk pen I'm using is my absolute favorite. I will link it in the description if you want to get the same one. So when I'm done, I've marked 4 boning channels, but depending on the size you're using, you may have more boning channels than what I'm showing here. Next, we're going to pin these channels in place. So you'll start at either the center front or center back of your corset, depending on where you have a seam, and pin the layers together, matching the seam allowance from the top layer to the bottom. If you don't have a closed center front or center back seam, start by pinning the side seams together. Basically, we just want to start pinning in the very middle of our corset, so wherever that is for you. With your middle seam pinned, then just work your way from the center towards the ends of the belt, smoothing the fabric out as you go. You'll need to pin the center front or center back edges as well, and then also pin the side seams together. So when you're all done, it should look something like this. Next, you're going to sew a line of stitching everywhere you have marked those lines in chalk. Here's what that looks like when it's done, and I've just rubbed the chalk off where I already stitched so it doesn't show anymore. Next, you'll put boning channels in the side seams. So first, sew a line of stitching down in the ditch of the side seam. After you do that, you'll sew another line of stitching right next to it, 3/8 of an inch away from the line you just sewed. So when it's done, it looks like this, and it's actually kind of hard to see that stitching because the stitch is in the ditch, but maybe if I turn it over, then you can see it a little bit better. So do that to both side seams, and then you'll do the same thing to the center front or center back seam if you have one. Only this time you're going to sew 3 lines total, one in the ditch and one on either side of the ditch, both 3/8 of an inch away from the center line. If you've got a center back seam, then exact same concept on the center back. And the last rows of boning we're going to sew are on the center front and center back edges. So wherever you have an edge, you'll sew a stitch 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, and you'll do that for both sides. At this point, if you want to add even more boning, you totally can. Just use the same principles we applied here to put them basically wherever you want. Next, we're going to finish off the neckline edge, so start by trimming down the top and bottom edges to make them clean. Then I just like to fold this in half to make sure it looks symmetrical on both sides. And if you trimmed out a sizable chunk on one side, you may have to repeat that on the other side to make it symmetrical. This doesn't affect the sizing at all, just the style of the neckline, so don't worry too much if you have to do some reshaping. The next step is to add stays stitching to the neckline, so just sew a stitch along the top edge, pretty much as close to the edge as you can get, catching both layers in it. This will keep the 2 layers in place when you're adding the bias tape. Now we're ready to bias bind the edge, so flip your corset over to the lining side and grab your piece of bias tape, making sure the length is long enough to sew along the neckline edge. If it's not already, square off the edge of your bias tape and place it at the edge of your corset. Leave about 1/2 inch of bias tape at the edge and fold this over the edge toward the outside and pin it in place. Then just pin the remaining length of the bias tape along the edge of the corset, making sure you're giving it a tiny bit of stretch as you pin. I do have an in-depth video on how to bias bind a corset, which can be helpful for navigating some of the more extreme shapes on here, so give that a watch if this is your first time binding a corset. When you get to the end, we're basically doing the same thing that we did in the beginning. This time cut your bias tape so you have 1/2 inch of bias tape past the edge, and then fold it over and pin it wrapped around the edge. Now we are ready to sew this, so just sew a stitch 1/4 inch away from the edge of the neckline. When it's done, it looks like this, and you can see that because of the light stretching we did, the bias tape already wants to curl up a little bit over the edge, which is really good. So now we can flip the corset over, and then you'll flip the bias tape over, fold the raw edge under, and pin it down so that you have about 3/8 of an inch edge of bias tape on the top. If you're working with store-bought bias tape, you'll already have that edge folded under, and you can just work with that. It works just the same. So with that done, now you'll sew a stitch right along the edge of that fold, which is about 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge. And when it's all done, it looks like this. Take that over to the ironing board and give it a good press, and then we're ready to add the boning. So next, grab your corset boning and your craft scissors, and we're basically just going to add boning everywhere that we've sewn a boning channel. Line your boning up along the top of the boning channel, butt it up against the bias binding, and then cut it 3/4 of an inch above the edge of the corset. In theory, the corset is symmetrical, so we can cut 2 pieces of each length, one for each side of the corset. I'll just place those down in the spot they're going to go, and then proceed to cut more boning for each channel. Once you've got all your pieces cut, you need to trim the edges of each piece so they're not sharp and can't poke through the fabric. To do this, I just cut it in a curved shape so it has a rounded off edge. Do this to all of your pieces, and then we're ready to insert these. Just slide the boning in between the 2 fabric layers and push it all the way to the top, and that's it. As you do this, just make sure your boning didn't end up too long for some reason. You don't want to accidentally sew into it as you're adding the bias tape to the bottom. When all the bias tape is in, I do like to give the corset a good pressing, especially if the boning has a little bit of a curve to it, and as you're pressing it, you can sort of bend it in the opposite direction. The heat of the iron will soften up the plastic and make it more moldable. When that's done, we're ready to add our bias tape to the bottom edge of the corset, exactly the same way we did that to the top. So add it to the lining side first, then flip it over and sew it to the outside. When that's done, we're actually all done with the sewing part of this. Now we're ready to add grommets. Your grommet placement will depend on the style you chose, but basically you need to add grommets everywhere you have an opening. On this corset, it would be at center back, but on this other style, we'd be adding the grommets to center front. So whichever style you're doing, refer back to the pattern to see the recommended grommet placement, and remember that there is 1/2 inch of seam allowance on the edge of the pattern. So I like to mark that out, and then you can fold it back out of the way to line up with the edge of your corset. I'm going to take a pencil to poke through those holes on the pattern, and then working on your lining side, line your pattern up alongside the edge, and then use a pencil or disappearing fabric pen to mark through those holes onto your fabric. Next, we need to turn these marks into real holes, so I like to use this fabric hole punch to do that, but you can also just use your fabric scissors to do it if you're careful. To use your scissors, fold the fabric along where the hole is and just make the teensiest, tiniest snip you can make, and then make another 2 snips perpendicular to that so that it creates an X shape. Just make sure to make these snips as tiny as you possibly can. You don't want it too big so that the grommet rips through the hole. So put the holes everywhere they're marked on one side. Then I like to fold the corset over and just mark the second holes through the first holes I just created so that they're symmetrical. Then you'll repeat the hole making process for the other side. Next, grab your grommet setting tool, whether it be this fancy one or a hand setting tool, and take the top side of the grommet and poke it through one of the grommet holes through the outside of the fabric. Then grab the back side of the grommet, slip it over the grommet, and use your tool to scrunch it in place. And when it's done, it looks just like that. Just do the same thing for all your grommet holes, and then when you're done, you should have something like this. The final touch is to add your lacing ribbon. Cut a piece of ribbon 3 yards long, and then cut the edges at a 45-degree angle like this. Then take a lighter and just barely touch it to the edges of the ribbon so it creates a melted edge like this. This will prevent the ribbon from fraying. Make sure that you do this to both ends, and you're done. Unless you have both front and back lacing, you probably don't want to lace up the corset until you're putting it on your body, but just to give you an idea, here's how it looks all laced up. And of course, if you have front and back lacing, then yours will look a little different, but yeah, here's the finished product. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you like this pattern, please comment below and let me know what other kinds of corset patterns you'd like to see next. And if you enjoyed this video, you can show your support by liking the video and subscribing to my channel so I can continue to make more stuff like this. Until next time, friends, happy sewing!